The air in the sand trap was a thick cocktail of stale beer, sweat, and cheap disinfectant that failed to mask the scent of desperation clinging to the cracked vinyl booths. It was the only civilian establishment for 10 clicks outside the wire of Al Dhafar Forward Operating Base, a purgatory of dust and steel where soldiers, Marines, and airmen went to forget the monotony of their deployment. Anya Sharma sat at the far end of the bar, a glass of lukewarm water in front of her, the condensation tracing a lazy path down its side. She wore simple canvas trousers and a plain gray t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She looked like one of the countless civilian logistics contractors who kept the base humming, forgettable, harmless, a ghost in the machine. Her stillness was an anomaly in the boisterous room. She wasn't reading, wasn't scrolling on a phone. She was just watching, her dark eyes absorbing the geometry of the room, the placement of the exits, the rising aggression in a corner booth where 3 Marines were turning bravado into a competitive sport. The leader of the trio, a sergeant with a neck as thick as a utility pole and a jawline that seemed carved from granite, detached himself from his friends. His uniform sleeves were rolled tight over biceps straining with prison yard tattoos. The name Miller was stitched over his right pocket. He moved with the rolling, arrogant gait of a man who had never been told no with any real conviction. He stopped beside Anya's stool, leaning an elbow on the bar, crowding her space. "Figured you must be thirsty, sitting all alone over here." He slurred, his voice a low rumble. "Let me buy you a real drink. Something that ain't water." Anya turned her head slowly, her expression placid. "I'm fine, thank you." The rejection, polite as it was, seemed to bounce off a wall of incomprehension. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in a sun-scorched face. "Don't be like that. We're all on the same team out here. What do you do? Admin? Paper pusher for some DoD contractor?" He gestured vaguely with his bottle. "Whatever it is, you look like you could use some fun." "I'm just waiting for my transport," she said, her voice even, betraying no irritation. She turned back to her water. This was a mistake. Her disinterest was a challenge. One of his buddies, a lanky corporal named Jones, called out from the booth. "Whoa! Bulldog, she turning you down?" A pencil pusher turning down a Marine raider. The Sergeant Miller stiffened. The nickname Bulldog seemed to inflate his chest. He was no raider, just a line grunt from a Marine expeditionary unit, but in this bar, perception was reality. He lowered his voice, the friendly pretense dissolving. "Look, I'm trying to be nice. A little respect is all I'm asking. Out here we protect people like you. The least you can do is have a drink with me." Anya's gaze remained fixed on the warped mirror behind the bar, where the distorted reflections of the room played out. "I don't want a drink, Sergeant. Please leave me alone." The finality in her tone cut through his drunken haze, but only enough to fuel his anger. His face darkened. The friendly mask was gone, replaced by pure, brutish pride. "You think you're better than me?" He spat, his voice now a low growl that silenced the nearby conversations. "You're just another cog. Tourist. We're the ones with boots in the dirt, the ones who bleed. You sit in your air-conditioned box and shuffle papers." He jabbed a thick finger towards her. "You wouldn't last 5 seconds outside the wire without men like me." She finally met his eyes. There was no fear in them. There was nothing. It was like looking into the flat, black lens of a camera. That unnerving calm was more infuriating than any retort. He felt a surge of hot, reckless fury. His ego, bruised in front of his men, demanded a physical response. He reached out not to grab her arm, but to assert dominance. He shoved her shoulder hard. It wasn't a playful push. It was a blow meant to unseat her, to humiliate her. "Show some respect," he snarled. The impact was solid. Anya rocked on the stool, one foot sliding on the grimy floor to catch her balance. She didn't cry out. She didn't gasp. She absorbed the force, her body moving with it in a way that seemed to dissipate the energy. She straightened up, her gray t-shirt slightly askew. She looked at the spot on her shoulder where he had struck her, then back at his furious face. Her expression remained unchanged. a blank slate of unnerving composure. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous passed through her eyes, a predator's assessment, before being suppressed. She slid off the stool, her movements fluid and deliberate. She placed a few crumpled bills on the bar to cover her water, her hand steady. Without another word, without a single glance at Miller or his stunned friends, she walked towards the exit. The path she took was direct, her steps even. The bar patrons, who had fallen silent, watched her go. Miller stood there, fist still half-clenched, breathing heavily. He had won. He had put the arrogant civilian in her place. But the silence she left behind felt less like a victory and more like the deafening quiet before a storm. He felt a strange, unsettling chill, a feeling he couldn't name. He had hit her, and her reaction wasn't fear or anger. It was nothing, and that was the most insulting reaction of all. He turned back to his friends, forcing a laugh. "See? Told you. All talk, these contractors," but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The next morning, the summons arrived. A crisp, formal order for both Sergeant Rex Miller and Ms. Anya Sharma to report to the office of Colonel Madsen, the base commander, at 0900 sharp. Miller swaggered into the command building, his uniform immaculate, his bearing a portrait of military propriety. He saw her standing outside the colonel's office, dressed in the same anonymous civilian attire. She looked small and out of place against the backdrop of tactical maps and motivational posters proclaiming, "Semper Fi," and "Aim High." He gave her a smirk, a silent reminder of his dominance. She didn't acknowledge him. Colonel Madsen was a man carved from the arid landscape he commanded. His face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, his voice honed by decades of shouting over engine noise and battlefield chaos. He sat behind a large oak desk, a monument to authority in a world of prefabricated metal. He gestured for them to enter, his eyes pale and sharp, flicking between the hulking Marine and the slight civilian woman. "I have a report," Madsen began, his tone clipped and devoid of pleasantries, "of an incident at a local establishment last night, an altercation between a United States Marine and a civilian contractor. Sergeant Miller, you first." "Report." Miller snapped to a rigid parade rest. "Sir, last night my fire team and I were on authorized liberty. The contractor," he nodded his head curtly at Anya, "was present. She was acting disrespectfully, sir, to the uniform. I attempted to de-escalate, to remind her of the customs and courtesies expected on and around a military installation. She became belligerent. I may have made contact while gesturing, sir, but there was no assault." He delivered the lines with practiced sincerity, a masterclass in sanitized truth. He was a decorated sergeant of Marines. She was a no-name paper pusher. He knew who the colonel would believe. Madsen's gaze shifted to Anya. "Miss Sharma? Your version." "He was drunk," Anya said, her voice quiet but clear. "He was aggressive. I declined his offer of a drink. He didn't like being told no. He pushed me. I left." Her account was sparse, factual, and devoid of emotion. She offered no embellishment, no plea for justice. Madsen steepled his fingers, his expression one of profound weariness. He looked at Anya, and his eyes were full of dismissive appraisal. He saw a liability, a civilian unaccustomed to the rough-and-tumble culture of a forward-deployed base, a potential source of paperwork and headaches. Her file, which he had reviewed that morning, was insultingly thin. Anya Sharma, logistics analyst, level 3 contractor, GS-11 equivalent. It was the resume of a bureaucrat. "Ms. Sharma," the colonel said, his voice dropping into a patronizing lecture, "this is not some corporate campus in Virginia. This is a forward operating base in a hostile environment. The men here are under incredible stress. They are warriors. There is a certain culture. A certain amount of friction is to be expected. You need to understand that and adapt. Frankly, your presence here is a privilege, not a right. One more incident, one more report crossing my desk with your name on it, and your contract will be terminated." You'll be on the next transport plane back to the States. Do you understand me? He didn't ask for her side again. He didn't question his sergeant's flimsy report. The case was closed. Miller stood a little taller, the corner of his mouth twitching in a triumphant smirk. He had been vindicated. He was the warrior. She was the problem. Anya held the colonel's gaze. Her face remained a mask of polite neutrality. Yes, Colonel. I understand. Good. Matson grunted. He turned his attention to Miller. Sergeant, you and your men are confined to base for 72 hours. Consider it a cool-down period. I don't want to see your face off this wire again until the weekend. Don't make me regret my leniency. Dismissed. Miller snapped a crisp salute. Aye, sir, he turned, and as he walked past Anya, he shot her a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She was nothing. He had proven it. Anya simply nodded to the colonel, a gesture of acquiescence, and walked out. She didn't look back. As she stepped out into the blinding desert sun, her composure didn't waver. She had been reprimanded, dismissed, and threatened by the highest authority on the base, all while her assailant was given a slap on the wrist. She filed the injustice away, another piece of data in a vast internal ledger. She had a mission to focus on. The colonel's opinion, the sergeant's arrogance. They were irrelevant noise. They saw a logistics analyst. They saw a woman who didn't know her place. They saw a victim. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see. Her work continued, silent and unseen, in the digital and physical shadows of the base, far from the concerns of men like Matson and Miller. They had dismissed the ghost, never imagining she was the one haunting their house. 3 days later, the illusion of routine shattered. The attack came not with the familiar, arcing whistle of a mortar, but with the chilling silence of a severed power line. At 1427, the entire base went dark. The hum of air conditioners died, computer screens blinked into blackness, and the ceaseless drone of the main generators fell away, leaving an unnerving quiet broken only by the distant shriek of backup alarms. It wasn't a simple power failure. It was surgical. Anya was in the base library, a quiet, climate-controlled haven of forgotten paperbacks and outdated technical manuals. She had been cross-referencing shipping manifests, the mundane cover for her real work of tracking subtle anomalies in supply chains that might indicate insider threats. When the lights went out, she didn't flinch. While others looked up in confusion, she was already moving. Her head tilted, listening not to the silence, but to what the silence meant. No generators meant the primary and secondary fuel lines were cut or the control systems were fried. That wasn't a random malfunction. That was sabotage. Then came the second sound. A series of dull, percussive thumps from the direction of the western perimeter. A section of the wire known for its blind spots, obscured by a shallow wadi. It wasn't the loud crack of an IED. It was the distinct sound of suppressed, heavy-caliber rifles firing in disciplined bursts. The base sirens, powered by an independent battery, finally screamed to life, a desperate wail that sent soldiers scrambling for cover and gear. Chaos bloomed. A massive explosion rocked the main gate, a classic diversion. Plumes of black smoke billowed into the sky, drawing the eyes and the immediate response of the base's quick reaction force. Armored vehicles rumbled towards the front gate, their gunners scanning for enemies that weren't there. Colonel Matson was in the Tactical Operations Center, the nerve center of the base, when the power died. The backup systems flickered on, but the main satellite comms array was dead. "Get me a sit rep," he roared, his voice cutting through the rising panic of his staff. "What the hell hit us?" Reports trickled in over short-range radio, painting a picture of catastrophic failure. Western perimeter breached. Sector Charlie 4. Multiple unknowns. Moving fast. QRF is responding to the main gate. They're pinned by something. Heavy machine gun fire. The voices were strained, laced with disbelief. Sergeant Miller and his squad were caught in the open, jogging from the gym back to their barracks. When the sirens went off, their training kicked in. They grabbed their rifles from the nearest ready rack and sprinted towards the sound of the fighting. But they were running towards the diversion. As they rounded the corner of a motor pool, a disciplined volley of gunfire ripped through their formation from an unexpected direction. PFC Vance went down, a red stain blossoming on his chest. Jones dragged him behind the wheel of a Humvee as Miller laid down suppressive fire. Contact left. Rooftop, K building, he yelled, his voice raw. They were caught in a perfectly executed L-shaped ambush. The attackers weren't ragged insurgents. They were trained, coordinated, and they were already inside. Miller's bravado from the bar was gone, replaced by the grim focus of a cornered animal. He was a good Marine, a brave fighter, but he and his men had been tactically decapitated, reacting to a script the enemy had already written. They were pinned, outmaneuvered, and bleeding. On the other side of the base, others faltered. Airmen trained for flight lines, not firefights, huddled in bunkers. Security forces were spread thin, chasing ghosts at the main gate while the real threat bled into the heart of the installation. The enemy moved in small, efficient fire teams, ignoring barracks and mess halls, flowing with purpose towards high-value targets. Their primary objective was clear: the TOC. Anya watched it all unfold with preternatural calm. From the library window, she saw a fire team of 4 attackers, clad in nondescript black fatigues and moving with the fluid economy of professionals, bypass a squad of panicked airmen and head directly for the communications hub next to the TOC. They were cutting the head off the snake before the body knew it was under attack. The crisis was escalating far beyond the base's capacity to respond. The system was breaking. The men in charge were blind, and the warriors on the ground were trapped. While they faltered, she processed. The diversion at the gate. The power grid sabotage. The comms blackout. The targeted infiltration. This was not a raid. It was an assassination. A decapitation strike. And she was standing squarely in the middle of it. The time for being a ghost was over. It was time to be a hunter. The world outside the library window had dissolved into a cacophony of screams, sporadic gunfire, and the impotent wail of the sirens. Anya turned away from the unfolding disaster, her face a mask of placid focus. The librarian, a portly man in his 50s, was fumbling under his desk for a phone that would not work. "We have to stay here. It's the rules," he stammered, his eyes wide with terror. Anya ignored him. Her mind was a cold, clear engine of calculation. Objective, command, and control. The attackers were flowing towards the TOC. That was the center of gravity. That was where she had to go. Path of least resistance. Not the main thoroughfares, which were now killing fields, but the interstitial spaces of the base, the service corridors, the maintenance alleys, the rooftops. Her work as a logistics analyst had given her an eidetic mental map of the base's skeleton. Her first priority was a weapon. The armory was on the far side of the base, an impossible destination. She exited the library through a rear service door, stepping into a narrow alleyway. 50 meters away, a lone security forces airman lay beside his patrol vehicle, his posture unnatural. Anya moved towards him in a low crouch, the staccato bursts of distant gunfire providing a rhythm to her steps. The airman was young, his eyes open and staring at the merciless blue sky. His M4 rifle lay beside him. She knelt, her fingers finding the pulse point on his neck out of reflex. Nothing. She gently unslung the rifle, her hands moving with an intimacy that spoke of countless hours of practice. She checked the chamber, seated the magazine with a firm tap, and slung it over her shoulder. She took his remaining 3 magazines and his radio, clipping it to her belt. The weight of the rifle was a familiar comfort, a solid and dependable truth in a world of chaos. She didn't run. She flowed. Using the patrol vehicle as cover, she scanned the area. 2 attackers were advancing down the main road, using practiced bounding overwatch. They were professionals, but they were predictable. They moved along expected lines of drift. Anya slipped into the shadows of a large generator block, the metal still warm. She waited, her breathing slow and controlled, a silent metronome in her chest. 1, 2, 3. As the lead attacker passed her position, she emerged from the shadow like a phantom. She didn't fire the rifle. The sound would draw attention. Her left hand clamped over his mouth, stifling his cry, while her right drove the butt of the rifle into the side of his head, just behind the ear. A sickening crunch, and he went limp. She lowered the body to the ground without a sound. The second attacker, 50 feet behind, saw his partner disappear. He paused, raising his weapon, confusion turning to alarm. It was the last thing he felt. Anya was already down on one knee, the M4 braced against the generator block. She didn't aim for the chest. She aimed for the head. A single, sharp crack, deafening in the relative quiet of the alley, and the man crumpled, his helmet sent spinning. 2 down. She was moving again before the echo faded. She took the dead man's radio, listening to the clipped, foreign tongue for a moment. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent, questioning. They knew they had lost 2 men. They would adapt. So would she. Her path was a masterclass in tactical movement. She climbed a maintenance ladder to the flat roof of a supply warehouse, giving her a commanding view of the area around the TOC. Below, she could see Miller's squad, still pinned down behind the Humvee. Miller was yelling orders, trying to organize a breakout, but a heavy machine gun, positioned on the roof of the adjacent administrative building, had them completely suppressed. Every time they tried to move, a torrent of lead ripped into the ground around them. Anya saw the bigger picture. The machine gun wasn't just suppressing Miller. It was providing cover for a 4-man team advancing on the TOC's last line of defense. A sandbagged bunker manned by a handful of terrified communications specialists armed with sidearms. Colonel Madsen was inside that building. She had options. She could try a long-range shot on the machine gunner, but the angle was poor, and a miss would reveal her position. She needed to get closer. She slithered across the gravel-dusted rooftop on her belly, the hot tar pulling at her t-shirt. She reached the far edge, directly overlooking a narrow gap between the warehouse and the admin building. It was a 12-foot drop into a dark alley. Without hesitation, she swung her legs over the side, hung for a second, and dropped, landing in a practiced parachute roll that absorbed the impact. She was now behind the building housing the machine gun nest. An external fire escape led to the roof. She ascended the metal stairs, silent as smoke. At the top, 2 men were feeding an ammunition belt into the weapon while a third was firing, chewing up the ground around Miller's position. They were focused, arrogant in their dominance of the battlefield. Anya unclipped a flashbang grenade from the vest of the dead security airman. She pulled the pin, cooked it for 2 seconds, and tossed it over the low parapet onto the roof. The grenade detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening concussion. Before their stunned senses could recover, she was over the wall. The M4 was up, spitting fire. 3 single, precise shots. 3 bodies fell. The devastating machine gun fell silent. Down below, the sudden quiet was jarring. Miller looked up from behind the Humvee, blinking in confusion. The fire that had pinned them down for 10 minutes was gone. He saw movement on the roof, a silhouette against the sun. It was a small figure dressed in civilian clothes. For a disorienting moment, he thought he recognized the shape. It was the woman from the bar. It made no sense. He shook his head, thinking the stress was making him see things. Then the figure was gone, disappearing back over the rooftop, and Miller's world was once again just about the next enemy, the next burst of gunfire. But the image was seared into his mind. Anya didn't wait for thanks. She descended the fire escape and continued her inexorable advance on the TOC. The path was clear now. She had dismantled the enemy's overwatch. The final confrontation was at hand. She moved through the alley, a gray ghost armed with a dead man's rifle, her face an emotionless mask of lethal purpose. The sudden cessation of the machine gun fire was a tectonic shift in the battle. For Sergeant Miller, it was a miracle. They're gone. Move, 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 he bellowed, dragging a wounded Corporal Jones towards the relative safety of the TOC's outer wall. His remaining 2 Marines provided covering fire, their desperation replaced by a sliver of hope. They collapsed behind a row of concrete barriers, gasping for air, the primary entrance to the command center just 50 feet away. But their relief was short-lived. The enemy assault team, the one Anya had spotted from the roof, used the lull to make their final push. They swarmed the sandbagged entrance, overwhelming the few armed comms specialists in a brutal, close-quarters flurry of violence. The door to the TOC was breached. Inside, Colonel Madsen and his skeleton staff were trapped. Madsen had his sidearm out, a Beretta M9 that felt like a child's toy against the automatic rifles of the attackers. He stood over his wounded communications officer, his face grim. He had failed. His base, his command, his people all compromised on his watch. He heard the heavy boot falls in the corridor, the confident shouts in a language he didn't understand. This was the end. Miller and his men saw the breach. "We have to get in there," Miller yelled, but they were spent, low on ammo, and facing a fortified doorway. As he prepared to lead a suicidal charge, he saw her again. She emerged from the alleyway beside the TOC, moving not with the frantic energy of a soldier under fire, but with the predatory grace of a wolf. It was her, the logistics analyst, covered in dust and what looked like blood, carrying an M4 like it was an extension of her own body. He stared, his mind refusing to process the image. Anya didn't spare them a glance. She saw the breached door. She saw Miller's squad, effectively out of the fight. She registered the tactical problem and formulated the solution in the space of a heartbeat. She tossed the borrowed radio to Miller. "Channel 3. Report enemy strength inside. Then hold this position. Do not enter," she commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. It wasn't a request. Before Miller could respond, she was gone, disappearing around the corner of the building. He fumbled with the radio, his brain struggling to reconcile the woman from the bar with the operator who had just given him a direct order. Anya didn't go for the front door. Her logistics analysis had included a thorough study of the base's schematics, including ventilation systems. She located a large air intake vent at the rear of the TOC, its grill held in place by 4 simple bolts. Using a multi-tool she carried in her pocket, she had the grill off in seconds. The duct was dark and narrow, but it led directly into the TOC's main server room. She crawled inside, the rifle pushed ahead of her, her body moving with a practiced serpentine motion. She emerged into the humming darkness of the server room, a spider dropping into the center of a web. She could hear the attackers in the main operations room next door. One voice barking orders. The leader, for maybe 5 others. She heard a single gunshot, followed by a cry of pain. They were executing the wounded. She exited the server room, a shadow in the emergency-lit corridor. She neutralized a lone guard in the hallway with a swift, silent takedown. She crept to the doorway of the main ops room. Peeking around the frame, she saw the scene. 4 attackers holding the surviving staff against a wall. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar across his face, was holding his pistol to Colonel Madsen's head. "The asset," the leader said in heavily accented but clear English. "The Kestrel files. Where are they, Colonel?" Madsen, his face pale but defiant, spat on the floor. "Go to hell." The leader smiled grimly and cocked the hammer. That's when Anya opened fire. She didn't spray. Each shot was a distinct, calculated act. 2 rounds for the man on the left, 2 for the man on the right, 2 for the one covering the hostages. Headshots. They fell without a sound, their brains not even having time to register the attack. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the clatter of dropped rifles. The leader spun around, his eyes wide with shock, swinging his pistol towards the doorway. He was fast. Anya was faster. She had already closed the distance. She didn't shoot. She crashed into him, her hand grabbing his wrist and twisting it with surgical precision. Bones snapped. The pistol clattered to the floor. He screamed, a sound of agony and disbelief. She drove her knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought the edge of her hand down on the back of his neck. He collapsed in a heap, unconscious but alive. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. The surviving staff stared, speechless. Colonel Madsen looked from the neutralized attackers to the woman standing over their leader, the quiet, problematic logistics analyst. He saw the cold, lethal efficiency in her eyes, the utter mastery of violence. He saw a professional of a caliber he had only read about in classified reports. Just then, the thumping chop of rotor blades grew from a distant whisper to a roar. A pair of sleek, black MH-6 Little Bird helicopters, unmarked and flying dangerously low, swooped in and landed on the tarmac just outside the TOC. The ramps dropped, and a team of 6 operators in sterile, high-tech gear disembarked. They moved with the same unnerving purpose as Anya. Their leader, a man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that had seen everything, strode past the bewildered Marines, past a stunned Sergeant Miller, and ignored Colonel Madsen completely. He walked directly into the TOC, his eyes scanning the scene before finally landing on Anya. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't comment on the carnage. "Is the package secure, Ghost?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The name hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Ghost, a call sign from the shadowed world of Tier 1 operations. Anya nodded towards the unconscious insurgent leader. "Package is secure," she confirmed. The Kestrel files were the objective. He's the only one who knows their new location. The pieces slammed into place in Madsen's mind. The thin file, the logistics cover, the bar incident, her impossible calm. She wasn't a contractor. She was a hunter, sent to track a high-value target who had infiltrated the local insurgency. The entire base, his command, had been nothing more than the hunting ground. The attack wasn't on his base. It was an attempt to eliminate her and her target. He and everyone under his command had just been caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't even know was being fought. Miller, standing at the doorway, heard the call sign. Ghost, his face went white. The woman he had shoved, the pencil pusher he had humiliated, was a legend whispered about in barracks rumors, a phantom of the special operations community. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a shame so profound it was physically nauseating. The aftermath of the battle was a study in contrasts. On one side, the base's conventional forces, Marines, airmen, security, were in a frantic state of organized chaos. Medics triaged the wounded, teams cleared buildings room by room, and engineers worked desperately to restore power and communications. The air was thick with the smell of burnt electronics, cordite, and antiseptic. On the other side was the quiet, chilling efficiency of the shadow world. The operators from the Little Birds secured the unconscious insurgent leader, the package, binding him and moving him to their helicopter with a practiced lack of ceremony. They spoke in low, clipped tones, their movements economical and precise. They were ghosts cleaning up their mess. Anya stood apart from both worlds. She had handed over the captured M4 to a wide-eyed security NCO and now stood near the silent helicopters, her arms crossed, watching the activity. The adrenaline had begun to recede, leaving behind a familiar, hollow ache. Sergeant Miller approached her. He moved stiffly, his left arm in a makeshift sling where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his sleeve and bicep. His face was pale beneath a mask of grime and sweat. The swagger was gone, replaced by a heavy, profound humility. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his squad watching from a respectful distance. He struggled for words, his mouth opening and closing silently. An apology felt laughably inadequate. An explanation, insulting. Finally, he gave up on words. He brought his right hand up in a slow, formal salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory gesture he would give an officer. This was different. It was the salute of a warrior acknowledging a superior, a sign of ultimate, unequivocal respect earned in blood and fire. He held it, his eyes locked on hers, his expression a mixture of awe, shame, and gratitude. The other Marines in his squad, seeing their leader's gesture, also raised their hands in salute. Anya watched him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Miller dropped his salute, his shoulders slumping in relief. The immense weight of his transgression had been acknowledged and, in that silent exchange, dismissed. He had been judged by a standard far higher than any military court, and in a way forgiven. Colonel Madsen came next. His uniform was torn, his face smudged with soot, but he walked with a new, somber authority. The arrogance had been sandblasted away by the reality of the last hour. He stopped beside the SOF team leader, who was overseeing the loading of the prisoner. "My base was compromised," Madsen stated, his voice raspy. He wasn't making an excuse, he was owning the failure. He turned his gaze to Anya. "You saved it. You saved my people," he paused, the words catching in his throat. "My apologies for the administrative oversight, ma'am." The ma'am was a surrender. It was a formal abdication of the hierarchy he had so fiercely defended in his office just days before. In this moment, rank was meaningless. There was only competence and incompetence, and he stood firmly on the wrong side of that line. Anya's response was characteristically sparse. "Secure your perimeter, Colonel. Assess your vulnerabilities." They knew where to hit you. It wasn't a criticism or a boast. It was a professional observation, a piece of intel freely given. It was also a dismissal. Her part in his world was over. She was already focused on the next step of her own mission. Madsen simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." From across the tarmac, a young airman first class named Chun watched the entire scene. He was a comms technician who had been cowering in the TOC when Anya had made her assault. He had seen her move. He had seen the impossible speed, the brutal precision. He had seen the ghosts of legend made flesh. He looked at the hulking Sergeant Miller, a man he had once feared, now saluting the quiet woman who worked in logistics. He looked at his base commander, humbled and deferential. The world no longer made sense in the way it had that morning. A new, more terrifying and awe-inspiring order had been revealed. He just stared, committing every detail to memory, knowing he had witnessed something he would tell his grandchildren about, if he could ever find the words. The respect she had commanded was absolute, silent and undeniable, forged in the crucible of chaos and paid in the currency of survival. Hours crept by. The harsh desert sun gave way to a bruised purple dusk, and then to the deep, star-dusted black of night. A fragile order had been restored to Al Dafra. The dead were counted, the wounded were stabilized, and the perimeter was reinforced with a new, paranoid vigilance. The hum of emergency generators was a constant, mournful thrum beneath the silence. The base was alive, but it was wounded, its illusion of safety shattered forever. Anya was not in the TOC being debriefed. She was not in the mess hall being lauded as a hero. She was alone, in a cavernous, dimly lit maintenance hangar at the far edge of the flight line, a place that smelled of hydraulic fluid and cold steel. The little birds and their crews were long gone, having vanished into the night as silently as they had arrived, taking their prisoner with them. Her mission here was over. A different transport would come for her before dawn. She had found a quiet corner behind a stack of massive aircraft tires. A single, bare bulb cast a cone of yellow light over her. In her lap was the M4 rifle she had taken from the fallen security airman. She had field-stripped it on a clean rag, its components laid out in a neat, orderly row. The bolt carrier group, the charging handle, the upper and lower receivers. Each piece was a familiar shape in her hands. This was her ritual, the quiet liturgy of the warrior. It was how she decompressed, how she centered herself after the storm of violence. It was a process of purification. Her movements were slow, methodical, and infinitely patient. She took a carbon scraping tool from a small kit she always carried and began to clean the bolt face, her fingers working with the delicate precision of a watchmaker. She didn't think about the men she had killed. She didn't think about Miller's salute or Madsen's apology. To dwell on those things was a weakness and indulgence. Emotion was a variable that could not be controlled, so it had to be compartmentalized, processed, and filed away. Instead, she focused on the task. The satisfying scrape of steel on carbon. The smell of the CLP solvent. the feel of the soft cloth as she wiped down the bolt carrier, making the metal gleam under the dim light. She cleaned the firing pin, the extractor, the gas tube. Each part was given the same meticulous attention. This weapon was not hers. It belonged to a young man whose name she would never know, a boy who had died defending a post. By cleaning his rifle, she was honoring his final act. It was a silent, anonymous eulogy, the only kind she knew how to give. The silence of the hangar was broken by the crunch of boots on the concrete floor. Her handler, the gray-bearded operator, appeared in the circle of light. He was called Shepard. He held 2 bottles of water. He offered one to Anya. She took it without a word, her eyes never leaving her work. He sat on a tire across from her, watching her hands. They didn't speak for several minutes. There was no need. Theirs was a language of shared experience, of silences that spoke more than words. "Package is talking," Shepard finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Kestrel is in play. We're moving up the timeline." Anya paused her work, wiping a smear of solvent from her knuckle. She looked up at him. "Extraction. 0500. SC-130 from the north ramp. Sterile transport. Your new identity package will be on board." She nodded once. "And the base?" "Madsen will be reassigned," Shepard said flatly. "Internal investigation. They'll call it an intelligence failure. They'll never know you were here. The official report will credit the QRF and security forces with repelling the attack. With assists from unidentified coalition partners, your tracks are already being wiped. Ghost." She looked down at the pieces of the rifle. Her existence was a constant state of erasure. She was a ghost in the machine of war, her victories unrecorded, her sacrifices unseen. It was the price of her effectiveness. She began to reassemble the rifle, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced economy. The bolt slid into the carrier with a soft click. The carrier group slid into the upper receiver. The charging handle locked into place. She joined the upper and lower receivers, pushing the pins home. She seated an empty magazine, pulled the charging handle, and squeezed the trigger, hearing the satisfying dry fire thwack of the hammer falling. The rifle was clean. It was whole again. She stood and walked over to a security locker, placing the weapon carefully inside. Her debt to the fallen airman was paid. As she turned back, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale rose. The call to prayer began to echo faintly from a distant village, a mournful, beautiful sound that cut through the military sterility of the base. Anya walked to the massive, open hangar door and looked out at the sunrise. The desert was calm, the dust from the battle having settled back to earth, covering the scars of the previous day. High up on the newly reinforced perimeter wall, Sergeant Miller was on watch. He hadn't slept. He scanned the horizon, his movements stiff and sore. His gaze fell upon the open hangar, and he saw a figure silhouetted against the rising sun. It was her, the logistics analyst, the ghost. She stood perfectly still, a solitary figure watching the day begin. He didn't look away. He didn't call it in. He just watched, his heart a tight knot in his chest. He was watching a force of nature, something far beyond his understanding. He stood his post, a changed man guarding the base she had saved, and watched until the sun was fully risen and the silhouette was gone, having vanished back into the shadows from which she came.